Xi Van Fleet is a survivor of Mao's Cultural Revolution. She came to some prominence during the Virginia governor's race that Glenn Youngkin won because she was one of the women, one of the parents who spoke out. I believe she was in Loudoun County, spoke out against the stilted curriculum of those leftist educrats on the school board and in the administration in Loudoun and Fairfax counties, parents that sparked the revolt against Terry McAuliffe that installed Glenn Youngkin as the governor of Virginia. She was a part of that. And since telling her story about surviving Mao's Cultural Revolution, news outlets have gone back to her time and again to get her perspective on what's happening in this country, not just what's happening in China, what's happening in this country that resembles what she experienced at a young age in China. And here's what she had to say over the weekend in an interview with Rachel Campos Duffy on Fox about what she sees happening in the U.S. in comparison to what she experienced in China.
I think America is quickly becoming a communist country, and our rule of law has been turned into what Marxists called proletarian dictatorship. The party in power is after its political oppositions, and it's not just the president, but people like activists, and they are now in jail. They are political prisoners in the free
Yes.
country of United States.
Political prisoners. Yeah, that's something that uh, smacks of communist, totalitarian communist regimes. She also had a message to those celebrating Trump's indictments.
Yeah, I have a word for them. Forget about Donald Trump. What's happening in America is that the party in power is abusing their power and going after any oppositions. Now it's Donald Trump. Now it's MAGA. But eventually it's everybody because communist regime would not tolerate any opposition, any dissenting voices. So they're coming after all of us, including those who are cheering and now for Trump's indictment, and they think they are on the winning team. They're not. We are all will become victims if we let them succeed.
For more on this, please be joined by Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can follow Gordon Chang on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon G. Chang is his Twitter handle. Gordon Chang, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dan and Amy.
What do you think about what Xi Van Fleet had to say?
Well, she's certainly correct. I mean, we are seeing, for instance, the political correctness that has gone beyond just normal bounds. And it does resemble what had happened in the Cultural Revolution in China starting in 1966. And the prosecution and persecution of political enemies of the President of the United States is extremely concerning because we do see this in communist China and in other totalitarian states.
Mm. And so we have our own PRC here, the People's Republic of China. And we've got the political ruling class. Interesting how the acronyms work out. And with respect to the People's Republic of China, you gave a bit of a post-mortem on the Republican presidential debate last week on this specific issue, and writing in Newsweek, there's only one candidate to vote for in the GOP primary if you're thinking about taking the threat that communist China poses most seriously. Who's that candidate and why?
Well, that candidate is the 45th President of the United States, Donald John Trump. And the reason is that Trump, during his 4 years, most significantly broke the engagement theory that had been prevailing in our country for 5 decades, and especially the 3 decades after the Cold War. It's not just America first. It is, we had a policy that put the communist China first over American workers and over American society. Now, Trump's record on China was not perfect by any means, but he moved the country in the correct direction. And candidates, others, and there are some good candidates on China. So, for instance, we heard Nikki Haley at the debate. But she and others are going to have to prove that as a practical matter, they can have and move the country in the direction that Donald Trump did, and with the same ability, because this really was quite a demonstration of the use of the presidential power to protect American interests against a militant communist state.
What about Nikki Haley, though? I mean, she was strong on foreign policy and even said to Vivek, you want to hand Ukraine over to Russia and you want China to eat Taiwan.
Well, that was really important because there are a lot of voices in the Republican Party that are supporting Vladimir Putin's position in Ukraine. Here, we've got to remember that whatever the historical aspects of Ukraine are, that Russia violated a sovereign state. And a sovereign state that it had pledged to recognize its borders in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. What Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't understand is that Ukraine is not just a battle between Ukrainians and Russians. The Chinese see it as a proxy war between themselves and the United States. And if we don't win, we will see China move against some victim in East Asia, whether it's Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, or India. And so Vivek Ramaswamy, who thinks, we just give up on Ukraine, is basically condemning the world to global conflict.
Well, what is moving on a Japan or an India or Philippines or even Taiwan? What does that look like? Because part of this is, as you understand, the threat is omnipresent, but it's a threat that's never been sort of made good on formally. Meanwhile, China is sort of insinuating itself all over the world through various ways. We've talked a lot on this show about the Confucius Institutes and buying up land. Obviously, you had the infamous spy balloon. So, I mean, you see the manifestations of it, but they've never taken that next step to invade Taiwan, for example. So, what is an incursion from communist China into Taiwan or one of those other countries you mentioned? What does that look like?
Well, we saw that in June of 2020, where Chinese forces moved below the line of actual control against India in the Himalayas. So that was an incursion, which would have become an invasion if the Indians didn't stop it. We have seen China actually seize Philippine and Vietnamese islands in the South China Sea. Right now, they're trying to take Second Thomas Shoal, and this is a flashpoint. The United States has warned China in writing that the United States is pledged to defend the Philippines, and that pledge involves the use of military force. So we had a warning of the use of force against China. Japan, they're trying to seize the Senkaku Islets in the East China Sea. So there's been Chinese aggression, and it has been small scale, but nonetheless, it's encouraged China to move even more belligerently because we have not stopped it. And that's to our shame, by the way. We have opened the door to more Chinese aggression in the South China and East China Seas.
Right. Well, how has President Biden allowed that aggression to continue?
He did that in Scarborough Shoal in 2012, where the U.S. and China brokered an agreement for both China and the Philippines to withdraw their craft from Scarborough, which is essentially part of the Philippines. The Philippines honored the agreement. China did not. They took Scarborough Shoal. The Obama administration decided not to uphold the agreement it brokered. So China then started reclaiming islands in the Spratlys. It moved against Second Thomas Shoal, and then it ramped up pressure on the Senkakus in the East China Sea. So basically, we told China that aggression works, and we legitimized the most belligerent elements in the Chinese political system. So we have an example of what happens when American policy, and this was Biden, by the way, during the Obama years. We have seen what happens when we have these weak policies.
And so your argument is that taking those islands, for example, for the purpose of controlling the shipping lanes, for the purposes of having more control over global commerce, is their way, sort of like how they produce, so many of our pharmaceutical drugs, how they the minerals in semiconductors and the production of solar panels and these sorts of things. This is all in advance of at some point flipping the switch and turning on the West.
Well, certainly. China's been very clear. They declared in May 2019 a quote unquote people's war against the U.S. That is a phrase which has resonance, which contemplates the destruction of the United States. China's regime, which tightly controls discourse in China, permits and encourages Chinese people to talk about the extermination of every American. So let's understand what's going on. Our society is at risk. We can lose our country. The Chinese intend to kill us. They've said it. We've tried to ignore them, like we ignored Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden only killed almost 3,000 people on one day. The Chinese intend to kill 330 million.
Really, you think that's their intention is
Jeez.
eradication?
In the turn of the century, the Chinese defense minister gave a secret speech talking about advocating the extermination of every American with disease.
So, so what's their play? I mean, what's they want to precipitate a confrontation, but obviously on their turf. So is that play to formally invade Taiwan, and you think that's possible in the not too distant future?
Sure, and they intend to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. That balloon that flew over our country in January and February was surveying nuclear weapon sites in the United States. And also on January 28th of this year, the green laser shower over Hawaii caused by a Chinese satellite was surveying atmospheric conditions, which were important for the use of China's hypersonic glide weapons. So they're contemplating the use of their most destructive arsenal against America.
But I mean, not again, not to minimize it, but they're incrementalists. I mean, it seems to me you're saying that at some point they're going to have, all of the pieces of the puzzle in place, and then they're going to launch something that sounds full scale the way you're describing it.
Yes, and they intend to threaten the use of their nukes to prevent the United States from defending Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, whatever. And we've seen this because Xi Jinping this year has purged the top officers of the Rocket Force, which controls most of China's nuclear weapons. And the only reason why he would do that is because he wants officers who will obey his commands when he gives the order to push the button. So we have to understand that nuclear deterrence is breaking down. And I know it's unthinkable, but on occasions, America's enemies, because we're oblivious, have struck us and have killed Americans. And China is so much more powerful than Osama bin Laden. So we have to understand what's at stake here. And we purposefully are trying not to do that. We have a political class that does not want to understand the dynamics of what's occurring in China.
You reacted to the influx of Chinese nationals across our southern border year over year. It's increased like eightfold. You suggested that wasn't people fleeing China for freedom. It was, at least in part, Chinese communist assets getting into this country so they can do damage from within. Is that a fair representation of your view?
Yeah, 99% of that unprecedented surge of Chinese migrants are people who are fleeing China. They have given up on their country. And these are not poor Chinese, by the way. These are middle-class Chinese who have given up on their country. But in that number, there are packs of Chinese males, packs between 5 and 15 of them, unattached to family groups, who pretend not to speak English, and some of them are known to have links to the Chinese military. And I believe they are saboteurs that on the first day of a war in Asia will attack America's grid. They'll poison our reservoirs, assassinate our officials, detonate bombs in shopping centers. Remember we found that lab near Fresno, which had 1,000 mice that had been genetically engineered to transmit disease. So let's understand that the risk is present, and it's certainly a danger.
Do you think the State Department, the Pentagon, has an appreciation for the
No.
nature of the threat? No.
No, they don't. They are preparing for war in the 2030s and 2040s, where if we get through the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to be okay for various reasons. But the threat of war is a now threat. It's not one later on. and they're taking planes and ships out of service to pay for new weapons that will not come on stream for 15 years. We are running low of munitions, and there is not a sense of that this is a problem at this time, not 15 or 20 years from now.
Why is the next 4 years the Overton window for the Chinese communists?
Because we're seeing right now is the failure of the Chinese economy, and Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is being held directly responsible for it. So he has two choices. He can allow himself to be removed from power and the Communist Party to fail, or he can rally the Chinese people with a war. And I think that he is going to choose the latter. But in any event, I'm not in his mind, but that's obviously an option for him, so we have to be concerned. So this is a problem which we face at this moment, which is much more acute than the Pentagon or the White House believes.
He is Gordon Chang. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can follow Gordon Chang on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang, the other way. Gordon G. Chang on Twitter. Gordon Chang, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Dan and Amy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Have you been struggling to find an easy, safe, and secure document scanning solution for Salesforce.com, Microsoft 365, SharePoint, or OnBase by Highland? Your struggle is now over, and it's time to get your documents and operations into the 21st century. With IoT Smart Connected Scanning, it's easy to turn physical paper into digital documents and have them directly uploaded to the cloud with IoT Smart Connected Scanning from IDT. And you don't need a degree in computing or IT to make it happen. Using QR code technology uniquely configured for your specific